Jonathan Hayes was no ordinary man. He had spent nearly 2 decades dedicating himself to law enforcement, climbing the ranks through hard work and a commitment to justice. Now, after years of service, he had been promoted to captain. The position was a major accomplishment, especially in a precinct known for its challenges. But Jonathan was not the type to boast. Instead, he chose to arrive quietly, observing and understanding the new environment he was stepping into. Jonathan's wife, Angela, was his strongest supporter. She had been by his side through thick and thin, always encouraging him to stand tall. When they moved to the new city for his job, Angela felt both excitement and caution. "This is a big step," she said, looking at Jonathan as they unpacked boxes in their modest home. Jonathan nodded, his calm demeanor unwavering. "It is, but we've faced big steps before," he replied with a reassuring smile. The precinct where Jonathan had been assigned was in a bustling city with a history of tension between the police and the community. Jonathan understood the challenges ahead. Before he officially introduced himself as the new captain, he decided to observe how things were run without revealing his identity. This was his way of understanding the true culture of the department. "I'm just another man in the city for now," Jonathan said to Angela one evening as they prepared to explore their new neighborhood. "No one knows me, and that's how I wanted to stay for a little while." Angela smiled. "That's so you. Always planning, always thinking ahead." That evening, the couple decided to keep things simple. They dressed casually, with Jonathan in jeans and a button-up shirt and Angela in a comfortable dress. They walked hand in hand to a small diner they had passed earlier. The place was cozy but quiet, with a few patrons scattered across the tables. As they settled into a booth, Jonathan observed the room. He couldn't help but notice how some people glanced at them with subtle curiosity, while others avoided looking at all. It wasn't the first time they'd encountered this. Jonathan had seen his fair share of judgment in life, but he had learned to rise above it. Angela, always the optimist, focused on the menu. "Do you think the pie is as good as it smells?" she asked, trying to lighten the mood. Jonathan chuckled. "I'm sure it is. Let's try it." They enjoyed their meal, talking about everything from the new city to Angela's plans for decorating their home. For a moment, it felt like any other night, but Jonathan's instincts told him to stay alert. On their way back home, the streets were quiet, with the glow of streetlights casting long shadows. Jonathan held Angela's hand tightly, sensing that this was the calm before the storm. "I have a feeling things are about to get interesting," Jonathan said softly, his tone thoughtful. Angela tilted her head, curious. "What do you mean?" Jonathan gave her a small, knowing smile. "Let's just say I'm ready for whatever comes next." Little did they know, their quiet arrival in the city was about to take a dramatic turn, one that would test their strength and resolve like never before. The sun had set, and the cool evening breeze brushed against Jonathan and Angela Hayes as they stepped out of their house. It had been a busy day unpacking and settling into their new home, so they decided to treat themselves to a relaxing night out. It wasn't about anything fancy, just a chance to explore their neighborhood and enjoy each other's company. Angela, ever the cheerful spirit, held Jonathan's hand as they walked down the street. "This neighborhood is quiet," she said with a smile. "It feels different from the last place, but I think we'll settle in nicely." Jonathan nodded. "It's definitely different, but change is good. And I have a feeling this city will be an important chapter for us." They walked to a small diner that Jonathan had noticed earlier during a morning drive. It was a humble, old-fashioned place with a neon sign that read Diner Delights. The smell of grilled food wafted into the air, inviting them in. Inside, the diner was just as simple as the exterior. Vinyl booths lined the walls, and a long counter stretched across one side where a waitress stood pouring coffee. The room had a quiet hum of conversation from a few other customers. Angela led the way to a booth by the window. As they sat down, she glanced at the menu, her eyes lighting up. "Look at this, Jonathan. They have homemade apple pie. You know how much I love pie." Jonathan chuckled. Then we'll definitely have to get a slice before we leave. The waitress, a kind-looking woman with tired eyes, came over and took their order. She gave them a polite smile, but Jonathan couldn't help noticing how her eyes flickered with hesitation before walking away. He had grown used to such small, telling moments over the years. As they waited for their food, Jonathan's sharp instincts kicked in. He could feel the occasional glance from a few other diners. It wasn't outright hostility, but there was an unspoken tension in the air. Jonathan didn't say anything, not wanting to dampen Angela's mood. The food arrived, and Angela immediately dug into her meal, chatting animatedly about decorating ideas for their new home. Jonathan smiled, listening intently, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He was always observing, always calculating. That was part of who he was, both as a husband and a leader. The moment lightened when the apple pie arrived. Angela's face lit up as she took her first bite. "This is amazing," she exclaimed. Jonathan couldn't help but laugh. "You always find the best in everything, don't you?" "That's because life is too short to focus on the bad," Angela replied with a wink. As they left the diner, the evening seemed peaceful. The streets were quiet, with only a few cars passing by. Angela leaned into Jonathan, enjoying the crisp night air. "This is nice," she said softly. "It feels like things are finally falling into place." Jonathan squeezed her hand gently. "Yes, it is," he replied, though his thoughts remained guarded. As they walked toward their car, headlights appeared in the distance. Drawing closer, Jonathan's instincts flared again. He didn't say anything to Angela, but his grip on her hand tightened slightly. It was just a simple night out, or so they thought. Neither of them could have imagined that what happened next would change everything. Jonathan and Angela Hayes were just steps away from their car, chatting quietly as the streetlights cast a warm glow on the pavement. The night had been calm, almost perfect, until the sound of screeching tires cut through the quiet. A patrol car pulled up behind their vehicle, its red and blue lights flashing. Angela frowned in confusion, glancing at Jonathan. "What's going on? We haven't done anything wrong." Jonathan's face remained calm, though his mind was already racing. "Stay calm," he said softly. "Let's see what this is about." Two police officers stepped out of the car, their uniforms neat and their expressions stern. One of them, a tall man with a heavy build, approached Jonathan's side of the car as he and Angela stood nearby. The other officer, shorter and stockier, lingered behind, his eyes darting between them. "Good evening, officer," Jonathan said, his tone steady and polite. The tall officer, whose name tag read Brady, didn't respond immediately. He shone his flashlight in Jonathan's face, then moved it to Angela. "You folks out late tonight," he said finally, his voice sharp. Jonathan nodded. "Yes, we're just heading home after dinner." "Is there a problem?" Brady didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a step closer, his gaze scrutinizing Jonathan. "We got a report about suspicious activity in the area," he said. "Mind telling me what you're doing here?" Jonathan felt Angela shift uncomfortably beside him. He kept his voice calm. "We just had dinner at the diner down the street. We're new to the neighborhood." The shorter officer, Turner, stepped forward. "New, huh? And you just happened to be walking around here late at night." His tone was laced with doubt. Jonathan's instincts told him to remain composed. He had faced situations like this before and knew how quickly things could escalate. "That's correct," he replied evenly. Angela, unable to stay silent, spoke up. "We're just trying to get home. Is there something we've done wrong?" Turner's eyes narrowed as he looked at her, but he didn't answer. Instead, he turned to Brady and muttered something under his breath. Brady nodded, then turned back to Jonathan. "Let's see some ID." Jonathan reached into his pocket slowly, keeping his movements deliberate. He handed over his driver's license, watching as Brady examined it closely. "Jonathan Hayes," Brady read aloud, his tone almost mocking. "Well, Mr. Hayes, you wouldn't mind if we took a look around, would you?" Jonathan kept his expression neutral, though he felt a flicker of frustration. "Look around. We're just walking to our car. There's nothing to see." Brady's eyes narrowed. "I'll decide that." The tension in the air grew thicker as Brady gestured for Turner to step closer. Angela gripped Jonathan's arm, her voice a whisper. "Jonathan, what's going on?" "It's all right," he murmured, though his own patience was wearing thin. As the officers continued their questioning, Jonathan's thoughts were already moving ahead. He noted their names, their demeanor, and every word spoken. He didn't know how far they would push, but one thing was certain. These officers had no idea who they were dealing with. The night had taken an unexpected turn, and Jonathan knew this was just the beginning of something much bigger. The street was quiet except for the flashing patrol car lights and the tension hanging in the air. Jonathan stood still, his steady gaze fixed on Officer Brady, who was now scrutinizing his driver's license, as if trying to find something wrong with it. Angela's grip on Jonathan's arm tightened. She could feel the unease building, but she trusted her husband's calm demeanor. Still, a question lingered in her mind. Why was this happening? "Mr. Hayes," Brady said finally, his tone cold, "you seem a little too comfortable. Most people would be nervous in a situation like this." Jonathan's calm voice didn't waver. "I have no reason to be nervous, officer. My wife and I are just trying to get home. If you have a specific concern, please let me know." Brady's jaw tightened, and Turner stepped closer. His flashlight shone directly into Jonathan's face, forcing him to blink. "You got any weapons on you?" Turner asked sharply. "No," Jonathan replied simply. "Mind if we check?" Turner's tone was more of a command than a question. Jonathan took a deep breath. He knew where this was headed, and it took everything in him to stay composed. "I'm not carrying anything, but I don't consent to unnecessary searches. We've done nothing wrong." Brady's lips curled into a smirk. "Unnecessary searches, huh? You sound like a lawyer or something. You hiding something?" Before Jonathan could respond, Brady grabbed his arm. "Let's just make sure," he said, ignoring Jonathan's calm refusal. "Hey," Angela shouted, stepping forward. "You can't just—" Turner turned his flashlight on Angela, his voice sharp. "Stay back, Mom. Let us do our job." Jonathan remained composed, even as Brady's grip tightened. "There's no need for this," he said evenly. "We're just trying to get home." But Brady wasn't listening. He pushed Jonathan against the car with more force than necessary, patting him down roughly. Jonathan didn't resist, but his eyes burned with a quiet strength. Angela's voice trembled with a mix of anger and fear. "This isn't right. He hasn't done anything." Turner moved toward Angela, his expression hard. "Ma'am, step away, or you'll be next." Angela froze, torn between her instinct to protect her husband and her fear of making the situation worse. As Brady continued his aggressive search, Jonathan's mind raced. He had faced challenges before, but this was different. These officers were abusing their authority, and they didn't even realize who he was. Finally, Brady stepped back, finding nothing. "Looks like you're clean," he muttered, almost disappointed. Jonathan turned to face him, his voice steady. "Are we free to go now?" Brady's smirk returned. "Not so fast. You've got a bit of an attitude, don't you? Maybe we should take you down to the station, just to be sure." Angela gasped. "You can't do that." Jonathan raised a hand to calm her. He looked Brady in the eye, his calm demeanor unshaken. "If that's what you want to do, Officer Brady, go ahead. But before you make that call, you might want to double-check my name." Brady frowned, his confidence faltering for the first time. The night had taken an ugly turn, but Jonathan knew one thing for sure. This was far from over. The tension in the air was thick as Officer Brady stared at Jonathan, trying to process what had just been said. He had expected Jonathan to back down, to apologize, or maybe even beg for forgiveness. But instead, Jonathan stood firm, his gaze unshaken, his posture calm but confident. For a brief moment, Brady hesitated. The confidence in Jonathan's eyes was undeniable. He had seen it before in seasoned officers, men who carried authority without needing to shout about it. But Brady wasn't used to seeing it in someone he had just pulled over on the side of the road. "What did you just say?" Brady asked, his voice slightly more cautious now. Jonathan took a slow breath, knowing this was the moment where everything could change. "You heard me. My name is Jonathan Hayes, and I'm the new police captain here." Brady's face went pale for a moment, his lips parting as if he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. He looked at Turner, who stood just behind him, his expression confused. The tension from moments earlier began to fade, replaced with a nervous energy. "The new captain," Turner stammered. Jonathan nodded, his voice firm. "Yes, I'm the new captain of this precinct. I was transferred here just a few days ago. I'm sure you're familiar with my name." Brady's face flushed red with embarrassment. He hadn't known who he was dealing with, and the realization struck him hard. He had assumed Jonathan was just another citizen, someone easy to intimidate. But now he stood before the very person who was in charge of the precinct. "I didn't know," Brady muttered, his voice trailing off. "I'm sorry about that." Angela, who had been quiet up until now, finally spoke. "You should be," she said, her voice laced with disbelief. "You had no right to treat us that way." Jonathan didn't respond immediately. He simply looked at Brady, who was clearly rattled. After a long pause, Jonathan spoke again, his voice calm but stern. "This isn't just about you and me. This is about respect. Respect for everyone, no matter who they are." Brady looked down at the ground, still feeling the sting of his mistake. Turner, sensing the shift in the situation, stepped back, unwilling to make things worse. Jonathan turned to Angela, giving her a small, reassuring smile. "It's okay," he whispered. "Let's get home." As Jonathan opened the car door, Brady called out to him. "Captain, I." Jonathan stopped, turning to face him. "What is it, Officer Brady?" "I just want to say, I'm sorry. It won't happen again." Jonathan nodded slowly, his expression hard to read. "I hope not. You should take a moment and think about the kind of officers you want to be." With that, he got into the car, and Angela followed suit. As they drove away, she looked at Jonathan, still processing what had just happened. "Did that really just happen?" she asked softly. Jonathan kept his eyes on the road ahead, his mind already working. "It did. And it's not over. This city has a long way to go." The couple knew that tonight was just the beginning of something much bigger, something that would challenge both Jonathan and the city's police force in ways they hadn't imagined. The next morning, Jonathan walked into the precinct with a quiet resolve. The sun had barely risen, casting a soft light through the windows, but Jonathan was already focused. He had not slept much the night before, his mind still turning over the events that had unfolded on the street. He knew what needed to be done. Angela had tried to comfort him, but deep down, Jonathan was aware of the larger issue that loomed over the police department. The officers he had encountered the night before, Brady and Turner, were just a small part of a bigger problem. There was a culture in the department that needed to change. It wasn't just about correcting one mistake, but about creating a shift in the way the entire force operated. As he entered his office, Jonathan paused for a moment. He took in the familiar surroundings, the framed certificates, the neatly stacked files, and the desk that had once belonged to someone else. Now, it was his. And with it came responsibility, not just for his officers, but for the community they served. He didn't waste any time. Jonathan called Brady and Turner into his office for a meeting. He knew this was the moment to make his point, to show them that their actions the night before had consequences. When Brady and Turner walked in, they were noticeably more subdued than they had been the night before. The cocky attitude from before had disappeared, replaced by a nervous tension. They both stood at attention, their eyes trained on the floor. Jonathan's voice broke the silence. "Sit down," he said, his tone calm but firm. The two officers took their seats, not daring to look up. Jonathan stood at the window for a moment, watching the activity outside. He needed to collect his thoughts before addressing them directly. "You both know what happened last night," Jonathan said after a pause. "And I want to be clear about something. What you did was wrong." Brady and Turner shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Jonathan turned to face them, his expression serious. "You don't get to treat people like that, no matter who they are. And you especially don't get to do it to your own colleagues." Brady opened his mouth, but Jonathan raised his hand. "I don't want excuses. I want to know how you plan to fix this. How do you intend to make sure this never happens again?" Brady swallowed hard. He had clearly thought about the situation all night. "Sir, we didn't know who you were. I mean, we didn't recognize you. But that's no excuse. We were out of line, and I know we have to make things right." Jonathan nodded slowly. "Apologizing is just the beginning. It's about actions. I'm going to be watching you both closely from now on. Not just in terms of how you treat people, but how you do your job every day. If you want to continue wearing that badge, you need to earn back the trust of the people you serve and the people you work with." Turner, who had remained silent up until now, finally spoke. "We understand, Captain. We'll do better. We'll change." Jonathan met their gaze, his voice unwavering. "I hope so, because if I see this behavior again, it won't just be a warning. You'll answer for it in ways you don't want to." With that, he dismissed them. Brady and Turner left the office quietly, their heads low, the weight of Jonathan's words heavy on their minds. As Jonathan sat back down at his desk, he knew this was only the first step. Changing the culture of the precinct would take time, and he couldn't do it alone. He needed the support of his fellow officers, and more importantly, the trust of the community. Jonathan had made a promise to himself and to Angela when they moved to this city. He would fight for what was right, no matter the cost. And now, that fight was just beginning. The next few days felt like a whirlwind for Jonathan. After the confrontation with Brady and Turner, things around the precinct started to shift. The officers were on edge, unsure of what to expect next. Jonathan wasn't just the new captain. He was someone who wasn't afraid to challenge the status quo. And the old ways of doing things were about to change. Jonathan spent long hours reviewing files, meeting with officers, and speaking with the community. He knew that real change couldn't happen if he only focused on what was wrong within the department. It had to be a two-way effort, with both the police force and the public working together. He called a meeting with his team, something he knew would set the tone for the months to come. It was time to make it clear that he wouldn't tolerate injustice, no matter who it came from. The officers gathered in the precinct's meeting room, some standing, others sitting at the long conference table. Jonathan stood at the front, his posture strong and confident, ready to speak to his team for the first time as their captain. "As your new captain, I want to start by saying this," Jonathan began, his voice carrying throughout the room. "I don't care about your rank, your years on the job, or where you come from. What matters is that we all have a responsibility to protect and serve this community with respect. And that means every single person, no exceptions." The room was silent. Some officers exchanged uncomfortable glances, but no one spoke. Jonathan could feel the weight of the room's attention on him, but he didn't falter. "Over the past few days," he continued, "I've seen some things that need to change. And I'm not just talking about what happened with officers Brady and Turner. I'm talking about how we treat the people we serve. It's time to rebuild the trust that's been broken. And I'm going to lead the way." There was a murmur among the officers, but Jonathan pressed on. "This isn't just about one bad incident. It's about creating a department that the people can rely on, a department that holds itself accountable. If we're going to ask the community to trust us, we have to start by trusting each other." The officers were listening now. Jonathan had their attention. They were beginning to realize that the captain wasn't going to just be a figurehead. He meant what he said. Jonathan moved forward with his plan. He started by implementing new training programs focused on de-escalation, communication, and understanding bias. He also introduced regular community outreach programs, encouraging officers to get to know the people they served, not just as officers, but as members of the same community. The changes didn't come easily. Some officers resisted, unsure of the new direction. But Jonathan stood firm, making it clear that this was the future of the department. There was no turning back. A few weeks later, Jonathan made an unexpected decision. He invited local leaders and community members to a town hall meeting at the precinct. He wanted to hear from the people, to understand their concerns, and to show that the department was open to change. As the town hall began, Jonathan looked out at the diverse group of people in the room. They were skeptical, but they were also hopeful. He could feel the weight of their expectations. This was more than just a meeting. It was a chance for everyone to start fresh, to build something better together. "I know that trust is something we have to earn every day," Jonathan said, addressing the crowd. "And I'm committed to doing just that. But I can't do it alone. We need your help." The room fell silent as people listened, some nodding in agreement. For the first time in a long time, there was a sense of possibility in the air. Jonathan knew that this was the beginning of a long journey, but it was a journey worth taking. As weeks turned into months, Jonathan Hayes found himself in the heart of the change he had promised. The streets of the city seemed different now, not just because he was the new captain, but because the people were beginning to see the difference in the way the police interacted with them. The relationship between the police force and the community was starting to rebuild, slowly but surely. Jonathan worked hard to ensure that the officers under his command understood the importance of connection with the people they were sworn to protect. He pushed for community outreach programs, where officers would spend time at local schools, parks, and events, not as enforcers, but as members of the community. He wanted the officers to be seen as human beings, people who cared about the people they served. One of the first programs Jonathan launched was called Coffee with a Cop, a simple but powerful initiative where residents could sit down with officers in a relaxed setting. It wasn't about making arrests or writing tickets. It was about listening. Jonathan believed that real change would happen when people felt comfortable enough to speak to officers, to share their concerns, and to feel heard. At first, the turnout was small. A few regulars, mostly elderly residents and parents with young children, showed up. But the impact was immediate. As the days passed, more people began attending, and the conversations became more open and honest. Residents who once felt afraid or skeptical of the police started to trust them more. And the officers, too, began to see the community in a new light. Angela was amazed at how quickly the program began to make a difference. One afternoon, she accompanied Jonathan to a Coffee with a Cop event at a local cafe. As they sat at a table, watching the interactions between the officers and the residents, she could see the walls slowly coming down. People who had once avoided the police were now laughing, sharing stories, and asking questions. It was a small moment, but it was powerful. "I think this is working," Angela said, her eyes following a conversation between an officer and an elderly woman. "The people feel like they can trust them." Jonathan smiled, but he didn't take all the credit. "It's the officers who are making the effort. They're the ones who are truly connecting with the people." But Jonathan knew that the trust between the community and the police couldn't be built on small events alone. He continued to push for deeper engagement, such as town hall meetings where community members could voice their concerns and suggestions for improvement. These meetings weren't easy, and sometimes the feedback was harsh, but Jonathan believed it was necessary. Only through facing uncomfortable truths could real progress be made. As the weeks went on, Jonathan noticed that the public perception of the police department was changing. People began to talk more positively about the officers, and the community as a whole started to see them less as a force to be feared and more as a group of people they could rely on. Jonathan's commitment to transparency and accountability was making an impact. The officers in his department were also seeing the benefits. They began to feel more connected to their work, and more valued by the community they served. In turn, they became more motivated, more empathetic, and more invested in doing their jobs right. One afternoon, after a particularly successful town hall meeting, Jonathan walked with Angela through the city's main park. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the landscape. "It feels good," Jonathan said, his voice reflecting a quiet pride. "The changes we're making, they're real. People are starting to see that we're here for them." Angela nodded. "It's only the beginning, but you're doing it, Jonathan. You're really making a difference." Jonathan looked around at the people enjoying the park, families, children playing, friends sitting together, and smiled. He knew the journey wasn't over. There was still much work to do, but for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. Months had passed since Jonathan Hayes became the new police captain, and the changes he had promised were now a visible part of the department's culture. The city felt different, too. It wasn't just the police force that had transformed. It was the relationship between the officers and the community, something Jonathan had worked tirelessly to rebuild. The air felt lighter now, as if people could breathe easier knowing that they had someone they could trust. Jonathan stood at the front of the precinct one morning, looking out at his officers as they gathered for the daily briefing. There was a new energy in the room. They weren't just following orders. They were part of a team, working together to create something bigger than themselves. For the first time, the officers truly understood the importance of what they did. They weren't just enforcers of the law. They were protectors of the community, responsible for the safety and well-being of everyone. "Good morning, everyone," Jonathan began, his voice clear and strong. "I just want to take a moment to thank you all for your hard work over the past few months. The changes we've made haven't been easy, but they've been worth it." He paused, letting his words sink in. The officers listened closely, their faces serious but hopeful. Jonathan had earned their respect, not through force, but through his dedication to doing what was right. "I've seen the difference in you all," Jonathan continued. "You're not just doing your jobs. You're part of this community. You're making a real impact, and that's something to be proud of." The officers nodded, some exchanging quiet smiles. Jonathan could see that they were starting to feel the weight of their responsibility in a new way. It wasn't just about putting on a badge and a uniform. It was about being a positive force in the world. Angela, who had been by Jonathan's side throughout it all, had seen the change too. They had gone through a lot together, and she could see how much Jonathan had grown. The man who had walked into the city months ago, uncertain about what lay ahead, had become a leader who inspired others. One evening, after a long day of meetings and community events, Jonathan and Angela sat together in their living room. The city lights outside their window twinkled softly, but it was the quiet in their home that made Jonathan feel at peace. "You've come so far," Angela said, looking at him with pride. "The city is different now because of you. People are starting to trust again." Jonathan smiled, but there was a quiet sadness in his eyes. "It hasn't been easy. There's still work to be done. But I know we're on the right track." Angela reached out, taking his hand. "You've changed so many lives already, Jonathan. And it's just the beginning." He looked at her, his heart full. "I couldn't have done it without you, Angela. You've been my strength through all of this. We're in this together." As they sat together, Jonathan knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy. There would be setbacks and challenges, but he was ready for them. He had built something stronger than a department. He had built a future where people could trust their police officers, and where officers could be proud of the work they did. In that quiet moment, Jonathan realized that the change he had hoped for wasn't just something he had achieved on his own. It was something the entire community had helped create, and that made it all the more powerful. The new era had begun, and Jonathan Hayes was proud to lead it.